In the golden towers of Manhattan, where penthouse suites gazed over the sprawling city, Arabella Dawson was a figure of awe and envy. Every party she attended became the highlight of the social calendar, every dress she wore set trends, and her Instagram feed was flooded with adoring fans, eager to catch a glimpse of her extravagant life. Yet despite her sparkling outer life, Arabella felt hollow. Her father, Charles Dawson, built an empire from the ground up, a man revered for his cunning and feared for his ruthlessness. Arabella was the heiress to his vast fortune, raised to carry on the Dawson legacy. From a young age, she had been taught that money and power ruled the world, that the elite lived by a different set of rules. And that love and happiness came second to ambition and status. Arabella's mother had passed away when she was very young, leaving her with only the cold, distant affection of her father. He provided everything she could ever ask for materially, but emotionally, there was a void no designer dress or expensive trip could fill. She was groomed for success, not love. Arabella attended the best schools, was educated in all the right subjects, and was surrounded by people who adored her wealth but never truly saw her. She was engaged to a young businessman, Preston St. Clair, handpicked by her father. Preston was the very embodiment of what the Dawson family stood for: successful, polished, and utterly soulless. But Arabella's life was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. One summer evening, while attending yet another lavish charity event, this one hosted by her father, Arabella grew weary of the artificial smiles and shallow conversations. She felt suffocated by the luxury that surrounded her. Slipping away unnoticed, she took a walk down streets she hadn't explored in years. Without her driver or security team, Arabella wandered into a part of the city that was worlds apart from the one she knew. The sidewalks were cracked, the streetlights dim, and the air was thick with the smell of rain-soaked concrete. That's when she saw him. Sitting on a park bench, half hidden by the shadows, was Jacob. His hair was matted, his clothes torn, and he was clutching a small canvas, painting the night sky. He didn't belong to the world of suits and cocktails, but there was something about him that intrigued her. His face was rough, but his eyes, they were filled with a depth she had never encountered before. Against her better judgment, Arabella walked toward him, her curiosity overpowering the warning voice in her head. They exchanged a few words at first, tentative, cautious. Jacob was reserved, aware of the differences between them, but he wasn't bitter. Instead, he had a calmness about him, a quiet wisdom that resonated with her deeply. Arabella learned that Jacob had once been a painter of promise, but life had been cruel to him. One tragedy after another had taken everything: his family, his home, and eventually, his career. Yet he continued to paint, pouring his pain and beauty into every brushstroke. Over the weeks that followed, Arabella returned to that park, often under the guise of volunteering at shelters or distributing food, but it was really Jacob she sought. They shared conversations that lasted hours, wandering through the forgotten corners of the city, discussing art, philosophy, life, and love. Jacob's raw honesty was refreshing in a world where people only told Arabella what they thought she wanted to hear. He saw her, not as the heiress or the socialite, but as a human being who was lost, just like him. Arabella knew that what was developing between them was dangerous. Jacob was everything her father despised: poor, homeless, broken. She knew the world she belonged to would never accept him, but she didn't care. She had never felt so alive, so free. With Jacob, there was no pretense, no facade to maintain. Then, one fateful night, everything changed. They shared a kiss under the stars, a simple gesture that was filled with the weight of the world. The moonlight reflected off the wet streets. And in that fleeting moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Arabella knew she was crossing a line she could never return from, but in that moment, she didn't care. She wanted something real, something that wasn't driven by appearances or expectations. The passion between them ignited, and soon after, Arabella discovered she was pregnant. When she first found out, a wave of panic washed over her. She knew the consequences of this pregnancy. It would be scandalous, a disaster for her family's reputation. She could already hear the snide whispers of society, the disapproving looks of the elite, and most of all, her father's wrath. She was carrying the child of a homeless man, and the world would crucify her for it. When Arabella finally mustered the courage to tell her father, the confrontation was worse than she had imagined. Charles Dawson was a man who prided himself on control, and his temper flared like a wildfire. "How could you do this?" he bellowed, his voice shaking the chandeliers above. "I built an empire for you, Arabella. And you've thrown it all away for some worthless vagrant. You'll ruin everything I've worked for." Arabella, trembling but resolute, told her father that she was keeping the baby. She would not hide or terminate her pregnancy to preserve his precious reputation. For the first time in her life, she stood up to him, defying the man who had controlled every aspect of her existence. His response was swift and brutal. He disowned her, cut her off financially, and cast her out of the family mansion. The media had a field day. The story of Arabella Dawson, the fallen heiress, spread like wildfire. Paparazzi followed her every move, capturing photos of her now modest life with Jacob. Headlines screamed that she had thrown away a fortune for a beggar, and society laughed at her. She became the butt of jokes. Her face plastered on tabloid covers with cruel captions mocking her downfall. People who once sought her favor now shunned her, turning their backs as if she no longer existed. Arabella and Jacob moved into a tiny, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city. The life of luxury she had known evaporated overnight, replaced by the harsh reality of survival. They struggled to make ends meet, sometimes going without meals, but Arabella never regretted her decision. She found a quiet strength within herself she never knew existed. Jacob worked odd jobs, painting houses, doing street portraits, while Arabella took up waitressing at a local diner. When Lily was born, the love Arabella felt for her daughter eclipsed all the hardship. Lily's arrival brought light into their lives, reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was hope. Arabella raised Lily with the values she had never been taught in her youth: humility, kindness, and resilience. Lily didn't grow up with nannies, private schools, or designer clothes. Instead, she grew up surrounded by her parents' love, by laughter and warmth, even in their tiny, cramped apartment. Jacob, though struggling, never stopped painting. He poured his soul into his art, using whatever scraps of canvas and paint he could afford. His work captured the pain and beauty of life, the human condition in its rawest form. One day, while Arabella was working at the diner, a well-known art dealer happened upon Jacob painting in the park. The dealer was struck by the emotion in Jacob's work and invited him to showcase his paintings in a small local gallery. At first, it was a modest success. A few paintings sold, enough to put food on the table for a while. But word began to spread. Art critics, collectors, and gallery owners took notice of Jacob's work, captivated by its depth and authenticity. His art spoke to people in ways they couldn't quite explain. It was as though each brushstroke told a story of survival, of loss and love, of finding beauty in the broken. Before long, Jacob's paintings were being displayed in galleries across the country. The same art world that had once overlooked him now celebrated him as a visionary. His work sold for astronomical prices, and within a year, Jacob was one of the most sought-after artists in the world. The man who had once lived on the streets was now living in a beautiful home with his family, his paintings hanging in prestigious galleries from New York to Paris. The media, sensing a new narrative, flocked to Arabella once again, but this time, they weren't laughing. The woman who had once been mocked as a disgraced heiress was now hailed as a symbol of perseverance, of love that transcended all obstacles. Society marveled at how she had chosen a homeless man over wealth and privilege, and how that decision had led to a life richer than anyone could have imagined. Even her father, Charles Dawson, who had once disowned her, found himself standing in the shadow of his daughter's success. His real estate empire had crumbled in recent years, brought low by bad investments and shifting markets. While Arabella thrived, Charles struggled. One day, in a moment of desperation, he swallowed his pride and reached out to her. Arabella, who had every reason to turn her back on him, met him with grace. She had learned much in her years of hardship, about love, forgiveness, and what truly mattered in life. Though their relationship would never be the same, she forgave him. She no longer needed his approval, nor did she seek revenge. She had found her own path. One paved with the kind of riches money couldn't buy. As Arabella and Jacob stood at the opening of his latest gallery, with Lily, now a precocious 5-year-old, by their side, they looked out at the faces of those who had once ridiculed them. The same people who had laughed at Arabella's choice were now applauding her, in awe of how life had unfolded. Arabella had defied the expectations of her world and emerged victorious, not by chasing wealth or status, but by choosing love, integrity, and truth, and in the end, that was the greatest triumph of all.